This is the time of year when our thoughts are for our families of all kinds. Our families by birth, by marriage, and those families we have chosen to create through common bonds, interest, and by love. Here at Tapestry, we gather in community and shared faith. Now, I know the holidays can be challenging for some Unitarian Universalists, especially those that embrace their spirituality, but not necessarily religion as it can be sometimes very narrowly defined. That's why our third principle is so key to how we worship together as a community. Our third principle again states, we covenant to affirm and promote acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. What that means to me is that although it is the day before Christmas Eve, and while there's a lot of talk about this baby called Jesus, a story I'm assuming you all are at least familiar with, there are many other amazing birth stories of other spiritual and inspirational persons that don't receive the same spotlight. While the story of Jesus was filled with radiance and angels and animals, some of you might be surprised to discover that his is not the only miraculous birth story with the same wonderful elements. To that end, I am going to share with you the birth story of two other children, that of Buddha and Confucius, both of which took place nearly 6 centuries before that of the birth of Christ. Now, as all good stories, the facts may become a bit blurred over time to allow the story to take a life of its own, to expand and capture the grandeur of the subject and reflect on the times in which they lived. These stories may be allegories. They may be an interpretation of real-world times in which they lived and the issues and messages wrapped up in a story that sounds a little bit unreal. However, they can also be as entertaining as they are informative. So, sit back, get comfortable, and allow me to share the origin stories of the Buddha and Confucius, again, tales even older than that of Jesus. The Buddha, whose given name was Siddhartha, which means he who achieves his goal, was born in what is modern-day Nepal. His parents ruled a kingdom near the Himalayan mountains, and they all lived in an opulent palace. The kingdom celebrated festivals, and the people of the kingdom would come and dance and sing. During one midsummer festival, Queen Maya had become tired of the celebrations and lay down to rest. She fell asleep and began to dream. In her dream, she was carried by 4 angels high onto a mountaintop and into a large palace gleaming of gold. There, she saw an elephant carrying a large lotus flower in its trunk, which he gave to her. In a quote from a book, long time ago, Lands Far Away, in one account, the queen, she took the flower. The room was filled with heavenly light. In her dream, she heard a terrific earthquake. Even the deaf heard the great roar, and the blind were able to see. Men who had been unable to speak at once began talking. Lame people rose from their beds and walked. In the morning, the queen told the king about her dream. The king summoned 64 of his Brahmins, or counselors, to immediately come and interpret the dream. The lead counselor exclaimed that the dream was a good one, and that it meant that Queen Maya would give birth to a son. The son would have 2 possible paths. If he were to stay within the walls of the palace, he would one day become a great king and ruler. If he left the palace, he would become a Buddha, a great teacher. When his birth was close, his mother, Queen Maya, told the king she wished to travel to her childhood home to give birth. Sounding familiar yet? The king agreed, and thus the queen began to travel, with her servants carrying her in her royal chair. However, when only halfway to the city, she stopped in a beautiful park. The park was filled with birds and fragrant trees. There, when she touched a blossom, her baby was born. It has been said that when the child was born, 4 angels appeared, holding in their hands the 4 corners of a golden net. Into this net, the baby was laid as if in a cradle. It was then that the baby stood and took 7 steps, looking north, south, east, and west. Then he lay down and fell asleep. The king, who wanted his son to be a famous ruler of his kingdom, did not allow his son to leave the grounds. He allowed only young, beautiful, fun, and healthy people to surround his son. So Siddhartha grew up surrounded only by beauty and joy. However, one night, he decided he was curious about what was outside of those walls in the world. So he snuck out of the palace grounds. Upon entering the village, he was astonished to see 3 things that he had never experienced before. There was an old man, a sick man, and a dead man. He had never seen these ravages of age, illness, and time. He then saw an ascetic, one of a group of holy men who had lived austere lives and radiated peace and happiness. Suffice to say, after seeing this, he did not become a famous king. After this experience, he began to study and meditate on what he had seen. He wanted to feel the peace and realize that the end of suffering is what leads to happiness, and spent the rest of his life learning and teaching about how to end suffering. At about the same time in history, but in a very different place, in China, in fact, there was a man named Kung the Tall, for he was very tall. In fact, the tallest man in the village. He was to become the father of the child Confucius. Kung had been a soldier for most of his life. He'd been honored for his bravery and prowess in battle. Now, at the age of 70, he had retired from his profession, and he looked after his large family of 9 daughters. However, Kung was not happy. Not only had his wife died, he longed to have a son to carry on his legacy. With this desire in mind, he asked the daughter of another noble to be his new wife, in hopes of conceiving that male child. And he was granted this marriage to Ching Se. His wife, knowing Kung's desire for a boy, prayed daily for this desire to come true. In an effort to appeal directly to God, she climbed to the top of a sacred mountain and prayed fervently for a son. That night, she dreamed that a spirit came to her and said, quote, "You shall have a son who will be a great sage and prophet, and you must bring him forth in the hollow of a mulberry tree." Soon thereafter, Ching Se became pregnant. One evening, while relaxing in her garden, she saw 5 men coming toward her. They were leading a strange but somewhat familiar-looking animal. These men were the essence of the 5 planets, Jupiter, Mars, Saturn, Venus, and Mercury. And they led a unicorn. Now, apparently Chinese unicorns apparently look a little bit like a cow with one big horn and are covered in scales like a dragon, just for the visual image. Testing to see if this apparition was real, the Qingse threw a scarf over the horn, and it landed, proving that the apparition was in fact real. The unicorn had in its mouth a piece of jade on which was inscribed the following words: "The son of the essence of water shall succeed to the withering Chow and be a throneless king." In essence, this meant that her son, though he would be wise and a leader of men, would not be a ruler of men. Although a bit shaken up by this encounter, as one would expect, Xingzhou also had great hope. When it was time for her to give birth, she reminded her husband that the birth was to take place in the hollow of a mulberry tree. Kung did remember that there was a cave named Hollow of Mulberry and told his wife. She stated their immediate need to go there. Having already heard the prophecy, Kung had already made these arrangements. Once settled in the hollow or cave, the childbirth came upon her quickly, and while giving birth, 2 great dragons appeared to the right and left of the entrance of the cave, and 2 spirit ladies proceeded to pour out fragrant odors into the air. And the 5 immortal men, the 5 planets, came to celebrate the birth of the child Confucius. As with the Buddha, this child grew up to be a wise man with many followers of his words and deeds. If we think about this, those 2 stories and how they were just described, we see some similarities in these stories of Buddha, Confucius, and Jesus. They share striking similarities in the place, the event itself, and even those in attendance. All were born in very humble conditions: a field, a cave, a manger. Each birth was attended by wise beings. They were summoned to these places to stand witness to these miraculous beginnings. And just for note, dragons are considered very wise beings. Also, so we see the ethereal, where we've referred to the assistance and attendance of angels. So what does this tell us? I think the answer in part is an exercise of your own heart, your own mind, your own soul. Do these elements in common mean that these events are equal and valid and each occurred just as they were told? Maybe one stands out to you personally, influenced by the life works of that same person. Or maybe they all seem a little too far-fetched to actually be true. This again, is why we support all spiritual paths here at Tapestry and as Unitarian Universalists. We recognize all people search for truth and meaning in their own spiritual lives. So, during this holiday, let us all practice embracing those friends and family that may possess a belief system slightly different from ours, that celebrate those differences slightly different than we do. And may we celebrate our own similarities in this place at this time. Amen, namaste, and blessed be.